Scott Ritter claims 2023 will be our last year on the planet. Scott Ritter, a former United Nations nuclear weapons inspector, hears the voice of the cancer-ravaged Johnny Cash speak these haunting words at the end of his song, "The man comes around." This is what we live in today, the former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer said in press conference aptly titled, "Can nuclear war be avoided?" This is not some sort of, future look into a hellish earth, Ritter said. Death is on a pale horse riding as we speak, and if you don't recognize it, if you don't know that, then you'll just happily go into the abyss. Ritter was one of the 5 panelists who spoke on the January 8 Winabar, which was presented by Diane Shar, independent of New York, a candidate for the U.S. Senate from New York. And in addition to Ritter, Shar were 3 more speakers: Helga Zepp-LaRoche, widow of American political activist Lyndon LaRoche, also a German activist and founder of the Schiller Institute. Colonel Richard Black, decorated Vietnam War veteran and Republican politician who served in the Virginia and State Senate. Stephen Starr, former director of nuclear weapons at the University of Missouri Clinical Laboratory Science Program, and a senior scientist at Physicians for Social Responsibility, who has worked with foreign governments to reduce the stockpile of nuclear weapons worldwide. The webinar, which you can watch on Rumble, was organized in response to recent events, escalating tensions between Russia and the U.S. and their NATO allies. Recent comments such as those by former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who let the cat out of the bag, and former French President François Hollande, suggesting that the Minsk II peace accords were never really about peace, but were intended to buy time for Ukraine to arm itself against Russia and the breakaway republics in the Donbass region. And at this point, it may seem to Russia that there is no point in negotiating, since it's now known that the U.S. and its allies did not negotiate in good faith. The U.S.-UK-NATO alliance is currently sending armored vehicles to Ukraine, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky cynically rejected an Orthodox Christmas ceasefire, which is basically 2 weeks after the December 25th date, offered by Russian President. And Diane Sayre believes it's up to us to change U.S. policy if we want to avoid a nuclear conflict with Russia, which would be an extinction-level event, what we call LA. And we are literally on the brink of thermonuclear war, Diane said during her opening remarks. She said, largely as a result of policies from the West, particularly the United States, and as American citizens, we have some control over that, she said. How much control the American people have over the increasingly revealed direction the U.S. has taken in this proxy war with Russia is up for debate, but Sarah and other panelists had some ideas, saying the point is to change the policy so that we avoid an immediate threat to human civilization. Now, we're looking at the end of humanity. This is what the risk entails, and we're moving right now so quickly towards an escalation, said Helga Zepp-LaRoche, who favors a diplomatic solution, believes the best hope we have may be an offer from Pope Francis, who said he would offer venue of the Vatican as a venue for peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia without any conditions. Zepp-LaRoche believes that the lack of preconditions is necessary to achieve any kind of diplomatic settlement. The Schiller Institute has launched a letter-writing campaign that has already gathered the signatures of more than 100 prominent people from 37 countries, asking those present to sign the letter as well. And if the Pope sees that there is support for his campaign, Zepp-LaRoche says it may be possible to put international pressure on the United Nations and other NATO countries, stating, and I honestly believe at this point that the only thing that will help this is all over the world, millions of people on the streets. As you know, we are very, very far from that. And indeed, the peaceful protests seem to have gone to the same place where all the flowers and flower children of the 70s went. Only a few dedicated souls continue to protest against the war, and their lonely voices are often drowned out by loud chorus of experts beating the drums of war and the roar of NATO armed vehicles and tanks heading into Ukraine. Zepp-Laroche also referred to recent comments by former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev suggesting that hypersonic nuclear missiles have been deployed off the coast of US and Europe. And he said basically they're coming so fast that the President of the United States would not even have time to get on Air Force One. The aftermath of the atomic explosion of Hiroshima, we have pictures here. Now, the Colonel Richard Black, who spoke in a pre-recorded message, believes some are upset about the war because he believes Putin should not be allowed to get away with it. The war on terror, he says, had been used to strip the U.S. Constitution of its vigor and diminish the rights of American citizens and citizens around the world. But the most recent example of that, Black pointed out, was the Nord Stream pipeline attack, which has been blamed on Russia, despite evidence that a NATO country was the culprit. A few moments after these huge explosions, he said, a text is intercepted. It was broadcast by British Prime Minister Liz Truss, and we know that's why she got, replaced, addressing Foreign Secretary Tony Blinken, who simply said it's over, and that was the sum total of the message. This was one of the largest terrorist attacks in history, Black said. The Western media immediately accused Russia of destroying one of the greatest engineering achievements in history. That's how the Russians had done it. Why? Because the Russians always do, and if an election does not go the deep state's way, the Russians did, everything is easily attributed to the Russians. The claim need not be rational, it doesn't have to be logical, it can be completely absurd, as it happens in this case as well. Indeed, the masses seem willing to accept without question that the Russians destroyed one of Europe's most valuable economic lifelines for no other reason that the Russians are just really bad people who do really bad things, said Black. And the lie, no matter how absurd or preposterous, is repeated over and over again until people believe it, especially when all other explanations are censored. No doubt, Nazi propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels would have been very proud of this remarkable achievement on the part of the modern secret service and its network of operatives and assets in the mainstream media. We are on the brink of thermonuclear war, said Major Scott Ritter. He recalled his former mentor, Senator Polk, who served under President John F. Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, you know how we avoided war during the Cuban Missile Crisis? Diplomacy. Old-fashioned diplomacy. Americans talked to Russians and Russians talking to Americans, he said. Back then, Ritter said, there were proven back channels that country leaders used to talk when official channels no longer worked, but today we're not talking. Yes, we have our intelligence chiefs meeting in Ankara, Turkey, and other places around the world, but this is not a negotiation. We are in the midst of not just an escalation of tensions, but we lack the mechanisms to resolve those tensions. There is no diplomatic action worthy of the name between the U.S. and Russia today, he said. Ritter said he had recently had lunch with the Russian ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Antonov, who negotiated the New START treaty with Barack Obama, the last arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. But these days, Ritter said, the Russian ambassador sits in a gilded cage here in the U.S. and no one talks to him. No one is talking about disarmament, everyone is talking about an arms race, Ritter said, and even though our so-called spokespeople on Capitol Hill believe the U.S. is on a path that is bringing us ever closer to Armageddon, Ritter believes they are delusional. He says the Russians will wipe us out in a nuclear conflict. There is no debate, no doubt about it. At one point, Ritter says there was a belief that the U.S. could launch a decapitation strike that would nullify Russia's leadership and that our ballistic missile defense system could protect the world from the inevitable retaliatory strike, which launched the Russian perimeter system known as the dead hand, quote-unquote. Well, the Russians not only checked us for it, they checkmate us for it, he said. Checkmate, which means that in chess, your opponent loses his king. Now, they have weapons today, and they are deployed. They are not theoretical weapons. Real weapons developed that nullify all of that. So America has no chance. If we ever start something like this, it would be destroyed before the people who started it knew they had failed. That's how fast Russian retaliation would be, he said. Ritter said the U.S. is prepared to spend trillions of dollars to modernize its weapons in hopes of matching Russian capabilities, but he said we cannot do that, and I'll tell you without any doubt, without fear of contradiction, every weapon system we are discussing right now to replace the existing triad is not enough to do the job. It won't work, and they don't scare the Russians at all, he said. Ritter, who recently wrote a book called Disarmament in the Age of Perestroika, the time of Gorbachev, says times were just as dangerous in the 1980s, only that's when we were talking. The US and Russia were negotiating. He said we reached a treaty. Why? Because the negotiators were veterans. They've been doing this for a long time, he said. The people who negotiated the START and INF treaties, Ritter says, were the people who negotiated SALT I in the 1960s and SALT II in the 1970s. They were experienced negotiators who had successfully concluded treaties in the past. But since those days, the U.S. has withdrawn from all but the New START treaty, which Ritter says the U.S. and NATO routinely cheat. Why, in God's name, would Russia sit down with the United States on anything, for anything? We are liars, we are frauds, Ritter says. We cannot be trusted, Ritter said. Adding that NATO countries such as France and Germany cannot be trusted as interlocutors in the UN Security Council because it approved the Minsk II peace accords, which turned out to be a fraud throughout the duration. And Ritter said, Helga, I wish you the best of luck with the Vatican, I really do, he said. And I hope you prove me wrong. I want you to prove me wrong. I want you to create a proper negotiating forum that actually works, but I'm here to tell you right now that Russia will never, ever, ever negotiate with anyone on Ukraine. Ritter believes the only way the U.S. NATO can come to the negotiating table is through a defeat, which he compared to the U.S. defeat by Japan in 1945, where the choice was sign the document or die, quote unquote. NATO will lose. The question is, will NATO lose with grace? Ritter asked, referring to the poem by Tom Dillon, is NATO willing to go gently into the night, or will NATO rage against the dying of the light? And that's the choice. Unfortunately, that's what we end up with. If NATO chooses to rage against the dying of the light, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to meet you. 2023 will be the last year we all live on this planet. Kiss your loved ones goodbye, do what you have to do, it's over, he said. Ritter believes that there is no longer any hope for negotiations because Russia can no longer trust US or NATO. From this point on, he believes that Russia will not seek negotiations and pursue victory, and unless NATO and the US find a way to accept it gracefully, we are all doomed to nuclear annihilation. I would like to prove Ritter wrong, but given Ukraine's rejection of a Russia truce over the Christian period, the possibility of negotiations seemed more remote than ever, and adding to this gathering of the perfect storm is the fact that the younger generations are not as aware of the dangers of nuclear war as those of us who grew up during the Cold War era. Diane Sherry called the peace efforts made by the Kennedy administration during those painful years in the 1960s. She played an excerpt from Kennedy's inaugural address. Finally, to those nations who would become our adversaries, we offer not a promise but a demand that both sides begin anew a quest for peace before the dark forces of destruction unleashed by science engulf all of humanity in a planned or random self-destruction. We dare not tempt them with weakness, for only when our weapons are undoubtedly sufficient can we be sure that they will never be used. But neither can two large and powerful groups of nations take solace in our current course, both burdened by the cost of modern weapons, both rightly alarmed by the steady spread of the deadly atom, but both struggling to change this precarious balance of terror that remains the hand of mankind's last war. So let's start from the beginning. Remember on both sides that kindness is not a sign of weakness and honesty is always subject to proof. Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never be afraid to negotiate. This is what John F. Kennedy inaugural address 1961 said. How are we going to fight back? Sarah asked. And she believes that all files on the Kennedy assassination must be released, and the agencies involved in this assassination must be cleared of their criminal record and held accountable to the American people or abolished. But that task, she warns, is too dangerous for a single president to handle. After all, Kennedy had expressed his intention to stand trial shortly before he was assassinated. It can only happen as a movement, she said. Sarah credits Oliver Stone's film JFK Revealed through the Looking Glass with creating public demand for the release of the documents related to the president's assassination. Some of the documents were released but heavily redacted. Others scheduled to be released were released, first by President Trump and then by President Biden. And a screen printed of President Kennedy: "We must end the intelligence agency's reign of terror in this nation," Cher said. "If the human race is to survive, let alone be free." Everyone who watched that happen to the Twitter archives knows this, but I would add it's deeper. Who tells the intelligence agencies what to do? Who finances Hollywood? Who owns the media? Who controls universities? Who pays for millionaire congressional campaigns? City of London and Wall Street. And that's why Lyndon LaRoche was such a threat. He was saying, we have to bankrupt Wall Street and bury it so deep that the stench doesn't rise to suffocate us. And Sarah believes that JFK papers would provide ample proof that our nation has become untrustworthy of its people and may open the door to legal action. The United States must return to the commitment and principle that not only are all men created equal, but that humanity is good and life is beautiful. Sarah wants to see the U.S. create a win-win economy that will eliminate poverty caused by misguided policies. And she said all this has to change in a short period of time. We need to bankrupt the system, reorganize. Billionaires will have to pay for it. They will survive. Maybe they will live in prison, but they will live. But only cockroaches would survive if the Ukrainian conflict erupts into Armageddon. Stephen Starr, who regularly lectures students about the realities of modern nuclear warfare, is shocked by how naive young people are today. He said they really have no idea what a nuclear weapon is or what a nuclear war would mean. It's like a piece of sunshine, and when it explodes, in a second it will create a fireball, and the surface of the fireball is actually hotter than the surface of the sun. If you happen to be under it, you will be vaporized, he said. And this is from Medium. I've translated this for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments. Thank you for your support. Please support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.